The world kept moving. The warm afternoon sun bathed the land in golden light. The soft rustling of dry grass filled the air, and a distant bird cried out, a sound of freedom. But she was not free. She was trapped. The mother bobcat dangled helplessly, her leg twisted in the merciless grip of a barbed wire fence. The sharp metal dug deep into her flesh, each movement sending a fresh jolt of pain through her body. She had been hunting for her babies, searching for anything, even a scrap of food. Hunger had made her desperate. She had tried to climb over the fence, hoping to reach the other side, where the scent of prey had lingered in the wind. But she had miscalculated. The moment her back leg slipped, the cruel wires had wrapped around her ankle like a snake, sinking into her flesh. She had struggled, thrashed, clawed at the dirt, but nothing worked. Now, her strength was fading, her vision blurred. Blood trickled down her leg, staining the earth beneath her. Yet, the worst pain was not in her body. It was in her heart, because a few feet away, hidden in the tall grass, her two cubs watched in silence. Their tiny, innocent eyes were locked onto her, confused, scared, helpless. They had been waiting for her return, their bellies empty, their bodies weak from hunger. But now, instead of bringing food, she had become prey herself. The mother bobcat tried to stay strong. She lifted her head, forcing herself to whisper a soft, trembling call. Stay back. But the cubs didn't move. And deep inside, she knew the truth. If she didn't escape soon, she would die here. And her babies, her precious, fragile babies, would die with her. Just an hour earlier, the mother bobcat had been a warrior on a mission. Her cubs were starving. She had seen the way their tiny bodies shivered, the way their once playful paws now lay still in exhaustion. A mother could feel her children suffering, and she had felt it in her bones. So she had left them, stepping into the cruel world one last time to find food. She had crept through the dry grasslands, her ears twitching at every sound, her nose desperate to catch a familiar scent. Prey was scarce. The land was cruel. But then a break. A small hare had darted into the open field, unaware of the silent predator lurking in the shadows. She had pounced, claws outstretched, hunger burning in her chest. But she had missed. The hare had fled, and in her desperation, she had chased it, blindly, recklessly, toward the human fence. And now she was paying the price. Her vision swam. The world around her felt distant. The pain in her leg grew numb. Was this how it was going to end? No, no. She had to get back to her babies. She tried again, her muscles screaming as she pulled against the metal, her breath ragged. But the barbs only sank deeper. A broken whimper escaped her throat. And then a sound, a rustling in the grass. Her ears twitched. At first, she thought it was another predator, maybe a scavenger, drawn to the scent of her blood. But then, two tiny figures emerged. Her cubs. The little bobcat cubs had never left their hiding place before. They were too young, too small, too fragile for the dangers of the wild. But now, for the first time in their short lives, they had no choice. Their mother was in trouble. She had always been the strong one, the fearless one, the one who fed them, cleaned them, kept them warm at night. But now she was hurting. They could see it in her eyes. And in that moment, something inside them shifted. Hunger didn't matter anymore. Fear didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was saving her. The smaller cub whimpered, pressing against his older brother. What could they do? They were just babies. The older cub didn't know the answer, but he knew one thing. They couldn't just stand there. He took a shaky step forward, then another, and suddenly they were running toward the fence, towards danger, towards the one creature who had always run for them. And nothing in the world could stop them now. The cubs had never felt fear like this before. Their tiny paws trembled as they stepped closer to the fence, their mother's blood scent filling their noses. The sharp metallic tang mixed with the dry earth beneath them, a smell they had never known but somehow understood. This was wrong. Their mother, strong, fierce, unstoppable, was lying helpless before them, her leg twisted in something unnatural. Her breathing was ragged, her golden eyes dull with pain. She had always been their protector. Now, she was the one who needed protecting. But what could they do? The younger cub, still too small to fully understand, let out a soft whimper and pressed himself against his older brother. The older cub didn't move. His tiny body was shaking, his heart pounding so fast it hurt, but he didn't look away. His mother was in pain, and he had to stop it. He took a step forward. His mother's ears twitched at the movement, and she weakly lifted her head. No, her eyes seemed to say, go back. But he didn't. Instead, he did something that made her heart ache even more. He meowed. It was a small sound, high-pitched, desperate, a baby's cry for help. But there was no one to hear him. No one except the wind, the silent trees, and his mother, whose strength was slipping away with every passing second. And then he acted. He stepped closer to the fence, pressing his small nose against the sharp wire. He didn't understand what it was, but he knew it was the thing that was hurting her. So, with all the courage his tiny body could gather, he bit it. His tiny milk teeth clamped down on the cold metal. He pulled, growling as fiercely as his little throat could manage. The fence didn't move. The metal was too strong, too unyielding, and his jaw ached from the effort. But he didn't stop. His mother let out a weak sound, something between a warning and a plea. No, little one, you can't. But he didn't listen. The younger cub, watching his brother struggle, finally understood. This was hurting their mother, and if his brother was trying to stop it, then he would, too. He moved forward, his little body shaking but determined, and together, the two cubs began their fight against the fence. They bit, scratched, pushed, pulled. Their small claws raked against the barbed wire, their soft teeth clamped onto the twisted metal. Their tiny bodies threw themselves against it with everything they had. But it wasn't enough. The fence didn't break. It didn't even bend, and their mother's breathing was growing weaker. Panic flooded the older cub's chest. This wasn't working. His eyes darted around wildly, searching, desperate. There had to be something. There had to be a way. And then he saw it. A few feet away, tangled in the dry grass, was a long, thin stick. It meant nothing to him, but he had seen his mother use things before, branches, stones, even her own body, to help them. Maybe this could help, too. Without hesitation, he ran towards it. The younger cub watched in confusion as his brother struggled to pick it up. It was heavy for his small body, awkward in his mouth, but he dragged it back toward the fence. He didn't know how, but something inside him told him this could work. Reaching his mother, he pushed the stick against the fence with all his strength, wedging it between the barbs and her trapped leg. Then he pushed down. Nothing happened. The younger cub, still unsure, watched him struggle, then looked at their mother's face. She was watching, too. For the first time since she had gotten trapped, her golden eyes weren't filled with just pain. There was something else, a flicker of hope. The younger cub felt something stir in his chest. He didn't understand what his brother was trying to do, but if their mother believed in it, so would he. With a soft whimper, he pressed his tiny paws against the stick, pushing with all the strength his small body had. The older cub pushed too. The stick groaned under the pressure, and then the fence moved. It was small, barely noticeable, but their mother felt it. A sharp pain shot through her leg as the barbs pulled against her wound. She gasped, her body trembling. The cubs froze. Had they heard her? But instead of crying out, she did something that sent a fresh wave of emotion through them. She moved. Despite the pain, despite the exhaustion, she gathered the last bit of strength left in her body, and she pulled. She didn't have much left, but she had enough. Enough to fight, enough to survive, enough to live. With one final push from her cubs and one desperate pull of her own, the fence gave way. The barbed wire loosened just enough. And in that moment, with a final burst of energy, she ripped herself free. Her body collapsed onto the dirt, panting, trembling, her wounded leg throbbing. Blood stained the ground beneath her. But she was free. She was alive. And when she lifted her head, her golden eyes landed on the two tiny creatures who had saved her. Her cubs stood before her, their chests heaving, their fur ruffled, their small bodies exhausted. And yet they had won. For the first time in their lives, they had been the protectors. And as the mother bobcat reached out weakly, pulling them close, the two cubs curled into her, pressing against her wounded body. They had saved her, but they weren't safe yet, because in the distance, carried by the wind, something else was coming. And this time, it wasn't just hunger they had to fight. The mother bobcat lay on the ground, her body trembling from exhaustion. Her leg throbbed with pain, fresh blood trickling from the deep wounds where the barbed wire had torn into her flesh. But she was free. Her cubs had saved her. She let out a weak, shaky breath and pulled them close, their tiny bodies pressing against her, warm and full of life. They had fought for her. They had won. But the fight wasn't over. A sound reached her ears, a low, distant rumble. It was faint at first, blending with the whispering wind and rustling grass. But it was growing louder, closer. Her ears twitched. Her body stiffened. Something was coming. She lifted her head, ignoring the searing pain in her leg, and listened. The cubs felt her sudden tension and looked up at her, their tiny faces filled with confusion. Then they heard it, too, a deep, powerful vibration beneath their paws. The earth trembled ever so slightly, the sound growing stronger with every passing second. And then, carried by the wind, a scent. The mother bobcat's heart pounded. It was a smell she knew too well, a smell that meant danger. Humans. She struggled to her feet, biting back the pain that shot through her leg. Her instinct screamed at her to run, to take her cubs and disappear into the safety of the wilderness. But she was weak, and they were too close. The sound was deafening now, a deep mechanical roar. And then it appeared. From behind the trees, a massive vehicle emerged, its tires kicking up dust as it rumbled down the narrow dirt road. A truck, and it was coming right towards them. The cubs froze. They had never seen anything like it before. It was like a monster, huge, loud, terrifying. The mother bobcat's breath came fast and shallow. Her injured leg throbbed, but she had no choice. She had to move. She grabbed one cub by the scruff of his neck and limped forward, ignoring the searing pain. The other cub followed, his small legs scrambling to keep up. But the truck was getting closer, and they were too slow. The mother tried to go faster, but her body wouldn't let her. Her leg gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto dry earth, the cub in her jaws tumbling from her grip. The younger cub let out a terrified cry and rushed to her side, nuzzling against her, his tiny body shaking. The truck wasn't stopping. The dust swirled around them, the tires skidding over the gravel. The smell of burning rubber filled the air. And in that moment, the mother knew they wouldn't make it. She closed her eyes, curling her body around her cubs in a final, desperate attempt to protect them. Then a screech. The sound tore through the air as the truck's tires locked up, the heavy vehicle skidding violently across the road. Dust exploded around them, filling the sky in a choking, blinding cloud. For a moment, everything went silent. Then a door slammed. Footsteps. Voices. The mother bobcat's heart pounded as she forced her eyes open, her vision blurry from exhaustion. Through the haze of dust, she saw them, two humans, standing just a few feet away. One of them was tall, dressed in heavy boots and a thick jacket. The other was smaller, wearing a cap pulled low over his eyes. They were staring at her, and she was staring back. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then the taller man took a step forward. The mother bobcat let out a weak, hoarse snarl, her body trembling as she tried to stand. Her cubs pressed against her, terrified but refusing to leave her side. The man stopped. He crouched down, his eyes locked onto hers. And then something changed. His expression softened. His eyes weren't filled with the cold, predatory hunger of a hunter. There was no weapon in his hands. There was only concern. He turned to the other man and spoke, his voice deep but calm. "She's hurt." The second man hesitated. "Is she dangerous?" The first man didn't answer. Instead, he did something the mother bobcat never expected. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a water bottle. Slowly, carefully, he twisted off the cap and poured some onto the ground. The mother bobcat's ears twitched. Her throat was raw with thirst, her body weak from blood loss. The scent of fresh, clean water filled the air, but she didn't move. She didn't trust them. The man set the bottle down and backed away, his hands raised slightly. "It's okay," he murmured. The mother bobcat hesitated. Then her cubs moved. Too young to fear humans the way she did, the older cub took a step forward. The mother's heart clenched. She let out a soft growl, a warning, but the cub ignored it. He was thirsty, and the water was right there. He crept forward, his tiny nose twitching. His paws barely made a sound as he approached the puddle. And then, cautiously, he licked it. The water was cool, clean, safe. The younger cub followed, his fear forgotten as he drank eagerly beside his brother. The mother bobcat watched, her body tense. The man stayed still, and after a long, agonizing moment, she made her choice. With a deep, trembling breath, she slowly lowered her head and drank. It was the first time in her life she had ever taken anything from a human, and it wouldn't be the last, because in that moment, as she lifted her head and locked eyes with the man, something passed between them, a silent understanding, a truce, and without a single word spoken, a decision was made. She had saved her cubs. Now they would save her. The mother bobcat's body ached with exhaustion, but something in her heart told her she had no choice. She had to trust these humans, at least for now. Her cubs had already accepted the water, their small bodies pressing against each other for warmth and comfort. But her? She was still afraid. For years, she had known humans as a threat, creatures that destroyed forests, set traps, and took away animals who never returned. Yet these humans were different. They had stopped, they had given her water, and now they were watching her, waiting. The taller man crouched lower, his eyes locked onto her injured leg. Blood was still seeping from the deep cuts, staining her fur and pooling in the dirt beneath her. "She won't survive like this," he murmured. The second man hesitated. "What do we do?" A silence passed between them. Then the taller man made a decision. "Get the kit." The second man hesitated only for a moment before hurrying back to the truck. The mother bobcat flinched as he moved, but the taller man didn't. He stayed still, his gaze steady, his hands empty, showing her that he meant no harm. The cubs, sensing no immediate danger, crept closer to their mother, and she let them. Even in pain, she was their protector. A minute later, the second man returned, carrying a small box. He opened it, revealing rolls of bandages, a bottle of antiseptic, and something metal. The mother bobcat's ears flattened, her muscles tensed. The scent of medicine filled the air. She didn't understand what they were doing, but her instincts told her it wouldn't be pleasant. The second man glanced at the first. "She's not going to let us help her." The taller man exhaled slowly, thinking. Then he looked at the cubs. They were watching him, their small eyes wide with fear and curiosity. And in that moment, he had an idea. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of jerky. The mother bobcat's stomach twisted. She hadn't eaten in days. Hunger gnawed at her insides, dulling even the pain in her leg. The cubs smelled it, too. Their tiny noses twitched, their bodies shifting toward the scent before they caught themselves, looking up at their mother for permission. The taller man didn't move. He didn't throw the food or force it closer. He simply placed it on the ground, an offering. Then he spoke softly. "It's okay." His voice was low, calm, not like the harsh, booming voices of other humans she had encountered. The mother bobcat hesitated. Her cubs, however, didn't. The older cub, the braver one, crept forward. His tiny body trembled, but the hunger was stronger than his fear. He sniffed the jerky. Then, cautiously, he took it. The mother bobcat's heart clenched as she watched him chew, his small jaw working quickly, his eyes closing at the taste. It was safe. The younger cub, emboldened by his brother, joined in, nibbling at the food. The men didn't move. They didn't try to grab them or get closer. They just waited, and slowly, the mother bobcat's defenses cracked. She was weak, hungry, in pain, and she needed help. With a deep breath, She lowered her head and asterisk asterisk for the first time in her life. Asterisk asterisk. She took food from a human. The taller man exhaled softly, as if he'd been holding his breath. She's trusting us, he whispered. The second man still looked uncertain. And if she attacks? She won't. The second man sighed. All right, let's do this fast. He reached for the antiseptic. The moment the bottle clicked open, the mother bobcat flinched. The sharp scent burned her nose, triggering every instinct inside her. But she didn't run. She couldn't. She could only watch as the taller man grabbed a piece of cloth, poured the antiseptic onto it, and, as gently as possible, pressed it against her wound. Pain exploded through her leg. She let out a sharp, hoarse snarl, her body jerking backward. But she didn't bite. Her cubs let out frightened mules, pressing against her side. The men froze. For a moment, it seemed like she would attack, that her instincts would win. But then she stilled. Her breathing was ragged, her body trembling. The pain was unbearable. But she knew, somehow, that it was helping. The taller man's voice was low, steady. It's okay, just a little more. She squeezed her eyes shut as he cleaned the wound, the sharp sting making her body tense. But she let him do it. She let a human help her. Minutes felt like hours. But finally it was done. The man wrapped a clean bandage around her leg, securing it tightly but carefully. And then he sat back. The mother bobcat exhaled heavily, her body slumping against the ground. The pain was still there, but it was different now. The bleeding had stopped. The burning had faded. And for the first time in days, she wasn't getting worse. The cubs, sensing the shift, crawled into her fur, their tiny bodies pressing close. The men watched in silence. Then the second man sighed. Now what? The taller man didn't answer right away. He looked at the mother bobcat, really looked at her. She was wild, fierce, but now she was vulnerable. She wouldn't survive if they just left her here. She was too weak to hunt, too slow to escape other predators. And yet she had made it this far, because she had fought, because her cubs had fought for her. And suddenly he knew, we take them. The second man's eyes widened. Are you insane? She's a wild animal. The taller man's jaw tightened. Look at her. The second man did. At her wounded leg, at her tired eyes, at the cubs, curled against her for protection, at a mother who had fought, suffered, and nearly died, but had never stopped trying. We take them, the taller man repeated, softer this time. And then the mother bobcat made a decision for them, because instead of running, instead of attacking, she did nothing. She just lay there, watching them, her cubs nestled against her. And in that moment, she gave in. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for them. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't alone. The world had changed, not in a way the mother bobcat once feared, but in a way she never expected. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't trapped anymore. And for the first time in days, she wasn't alone. The humans had taken her in. She didn't understand where they were taking her. The ground beneath her was strange, smooth, unnatural. The loud hum of their moving den vibrated against her aching body. The scent of metal and unfamiliar things filled the air. And yet, she wasn't afraid. Her cubs were with her, curled up in the small, soft space the humans had placed them in. The bandage on her leg was snug, holding her wound together. And the humans, they weren't forcing her to do anything. They weren't hurting her. They simply waited. The taller man drove, his hands steady on the wheel. The second man sat beside him, still tense, still unsure. She's just sitting there, the second man muttered. The taller man glanced in the mirror, meeting the mother bobcat's tired, golden eyes. She knows, he said simply. The second man scoffed. Knows what? That we're helping her. The second man didn't answer, but deep down he saw it too. They arrived at a place the mother bobcat had never seen before. It was still the wild, still surrounded by trees and earth and open sky. But something was different. The air carried the scent of many animals. Some large, some small, some injured, like her The mother bobcat's ears twitched. Her cubs huddled close, their tiny bodies pressing into her fur, as the men opened the moving den and carefully stepped out. The taller man crouched beside them, his voice low and steady. "All right, girl, let's get you somewhere safe." Slowly, carefully, he placed something soft on the ground, a blanket. Then he did something unexpected. He didn't grab her. He didn't force her. He simply waited. And she understood. With a deep breath, she moved. Her injured leg protested, but she pushed forward, stepping onto the blanket. Her cubs followed without hesitation. The men lifted the blanket gently, carrying her toward a den that smelled of healing, a place where animals had come before her, a place she never thought she'd end up, a sanctuary. The next days were a blur. The mother bobcat slept. She hadn't realized how much she needed it. Her cubs stayed close, but they no longer trembled. They explored, their small paws stepping cautiously over the wooden floors of the strange den. The humans came and went. They didn't try to cage her. They didn't try to tame her. They only helped. They brought food, fresh meat, more than she had eaten in weeks. They changed her bandages, making sure the wound on her leg didn't worsen. And every time they approached, they spoke softly. They knew she would never be one of them. They knew she was wild, fierce, but they also knew she deserved a chance to survive. And she took it. Days turned to weeks. The wound healed. Her strength returned. And something inside her changed. She no longer flinched when they came close. She no longer saw them as a threat. She saw them for what they truly were, a miracle. She didn't understand their world, their tools, their strange ways of moving, speaking, helping, but she knew one thing. They had saved her, and because of them, her cubs had a future. The morning the humans opened the gate, she knew what it meant. She stood at the threshold, her cubs by her side, their fur brushing against hers. The forest stretched before her, endless. It was hers again, her home, her freedom. The taller man stood behind her, watching. "You're ready," he murmured. The second man, the one who had doubted her, shook his head. "She'll never look back." But the taller man, he wasn't so sure. The mother bobcat took a step forward, then another. Her cubs followed, their tiny paws sinking into familiar earth. She could hear the wind, the rustling of leaves, the heartbeat of the wild calling her home. But just as she reached the edge of the trees, she stopped. She turned her head, just once, and for the briefest moment, her golden eyes met the humans. She didn't thank them. She didn't stay. She was a wild thing. But in that moment, they knew. She remembered. And then she was gone, disappearing into the trees where she and her cubs belonged. But the world would never forget what her cubs had done for her. A mother had been saved. A family had been given another chance. And all because two tiny bobcat cubs had refused to give up on the one who had always fought for them. And that left the world in tears.